It is May 29th, 2025, and the Western media is starting to admit that they're seeing Russian advances on the battlefield against Kiev's forces, that Russia is launching some of its largest drone and missile attacks in Ukraine. And it's raising the question of what can the Trump administration do? In fact, the New York Times editorial board just published an op-ed with the title, "If Trump Walks Away from Ukraine Now, Putin Wins." And it's interesting because we haven't seen any signals that Trump is going to walk away from Ukraine, but we have seen Russia make it very clear that while they are happy to have talks with Washington and with Kiev, that they are still focusing on the situation on the battlefield and on this ongoing war of attrition. So when they do gain more territory, it's not just about the land, it's about grinding down Kiev's forces in the process. And as we're seeing, the West is continuing to keep Kiev on life support, putting them in a very dangerous situation and raising the stakes even higher for where this war could go and for what it could mean for the overall war between Russia and NATO. So what does this mean for where US foreign policy is headed as they continue to spend more money? They continue to strategically try to target countries like Russia, China, and Iran, and so on and so forth. Where could all of this be headed? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me on again.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here because, as we know, Germany has a new chancellor and he has been doing quite a lot of talking this week, including revealing that the UK, France, and the US have all removed their restrictions on the use of long-range weapons on Russian territory. They claim it's Ukraine's use, but we really know just how involved they are. And the Trump administration hasn't really denied any of this. So it would seem that instead of Trump breaking away from Europe, he's still working pretty closely with them in this ongoing proxy war against Russia, which is exactly what you've been warning about for months. So how do you see the current situation?
Well, it's interesting because not only is the US still working very closely with Europe, waging this war on Russia through Ukraine, but the Trump administration is going through extra measures to try to conceal it from the President Trump support base, from the American public, and to continue masquerading as if there is some sort of divide. And we all know that all of these weapons, regardless of which country they come from, the United States has a command structure in place in Germany specifically, overseeing everything that's taking place, from strategic planning for major offensives to picking individual targets, not only on the battlefield inside Ukraine, but also inside Russian territory. And so all of these weapons that they're taking the limits off of will all require American intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance to pick targets and strike targets. So the US is obviously involved. They obviously made this decision, and they're laundering the escalation through Germany to make it out as if somehow Germany decided this for the US, which is unrealistic. It obviously isn't true, but this is what they're trying to pose as.
Yeah, I would think if it was Germany making this decision, that would, give Trump the perfect opportunity to come out and to say, no, we're not going to stand by that. We don't want to see this war escalate. But exactly as you're saying there, they're doing this dance of Trump claiming he just wants to see this war end. He's the perfect third-party broker, while at the same time sending more weapons and escalating things further. And it's also been interesting, too, when you look at the fact that, Trump could have come in and done everything possible to make this quote unquote Biden's war. And I know that a lot of people really hope that that would be the case. Some people still hope that that would be the case. When it comes to the opposite that we've seen from Trump, do you think that that says as much about Trump and what he intended to do going in? Does it tell us about the people around him, like the Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, those types who are directly in his ear and who have never met a war that they didn't like, or is there more to it?
Well, just as the Trump administration is trying to pose as uninvolved in this escalation that they obviously made the decision on and then told Germany to announce it, the continuation of the proxy war, trying to dump it onto Europe, get them to take a larger role in fighting the proxy war. But more importantly, they're trying to freeze the conflict because they need to pivot to China and contain the rise of China. They need to redirect the resources they're wasting on Ukraine in a proxy war they're currently losing. They want to freeze the conflict, go to China, and then come back. This is called strategic sequencing. The U.S. asking Europe to take more public money away from the European people and their interests and pouring it into this proxy war. This is called a division of labor. This isn't an idea that the Trump administration came up with, even though they have said this. This was written out in policy papers that go back to 2020. There was the first policy paper on strategic sequencing was in 2020. There was another one written in 2024. And then there was Project 2025, which was actually published in 2023, which all that could be confusing. But the main idea to take away here is all of this was published. All of these policies were out there before President Trump stepped foot into office. This is what he always intended to do going into office. That is exactly what he is doing. He's saying one thing, but if you look at the actual actions, the decisions being made by the Trump administration and how it's manifesting itself on the ground in places like Ukraine, it's very clear that that is what they're doing.
Yeah, and that's so interesting when you bring up the strategic sequencing, because we look at that really does feel like exactly what the Trump administration is doing is it's going Russia, China, Iran, right? Looking at all these different conflicts, carrying out, as we've talked about before, carrying out talks, saying, hey, we're more than willing to talk, but then as they're kind of setting up Iran right now, getting ready to set up that perfect deal, but knowing that they've got their buddies over in Israel with a possible attack, knowing that as they're carrying out these talks with Russia, they're still sending weapons to Ukraine. They're still directly involved in the conflict. And when I look at the US, I go, okay, I feel like the most logical thing to say is, okay, we can't handle all of these different conflicts. Is there a point where they aren't acting as strategically as they could and they get overwhelmed, especially when you take into account that Russia, China, and Iran are all allies with one another? Or is this one of those things where the US is still using as much power as it possibly can for as long as it possibly can at this point?
Well, this is exactly what they lay out in the policy papers. They mentioned that the United States, even then, these were in previous years. Even then, the United States was not capable of taking Russia, China, and Iran. There's also North Korea. There's also other countries the U.S. is trying to deal with. They cannot take everyone on at the same time. And so that is why they're talking about strategic sequencing, prioritizing who needs to be dealt with first, and then circling back to others that they feel like they can deal with later. They wanted to eliminate Russia, probably Iran, and then finish off China, but they have now run out of time. They are losing the proxy war in Ukraine, and they desperately want to freeze that. It's hard to tell whether they're going to attack Iran first and then move on to China. That might make some sense considering the hydrocarbons flowing from the Middle East, not just from Iran, but the entire region flowing to China. A catastrophic war in the region would disrupt that. It would hinder the Chinese economy, and that would be a great starting point for the U.S. to then try to encircle, contain, and undermine stability in China itself. So there definitely is strategic sequencing taking place. There is no definite schedule that they're going off of as these nations that are being targeted make decisions and carry out their own policies and attempt to defend themselves. The U.S. is going to have to react accordingly. At the end of the day, though, as I have said many times before, this idea of the U.S. maintaining primacy over the entire planet is absurd. It's absurd. It's irrational. It's unsustainable. The U.S. makes up 4 to 5% of the whole global population, and they seek dominion over the other 96%. It's ridiculous. All of these other nations have caught up. Many Americans, including these experts writing these policy papers, honestly appear at least to believe that America is just inherently superior. Americans and the West is inherently superior to everyone else in the world. So they think somehow that compensates, but it doesn't, and it isn't. And so this is the problem that they're running up against. The clock is obviously ticking. They're running out of time, and the challenges that they face are becoming greater and greater. And I think there's desperation setting in, but when interests like this become desperate, they become incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, that is a very important thing to keep in mind. And yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up because I was thinking about that, with these policy papers, it's fascinating how spot on the strategy is, right? How you can look back at one from over a decade ago and go, that's exactly what they're doing today. But yeah, the other factors in there, what Russia will do, what China will do, how they will continue to grow, those aren't always accurately accounted for. And now, when it comes to what we're seeing right now with Russia and Ukraine and the ongoing war, I thought it was interesting that the New York Times came out earlier today and they said that the Kremlin's summer offensive appears to be underway. They noted that Russian forces are advancing on the battlefield at the fastest pace this year, that they are bombarding Ukrainian cities with some of the biggest drone and missile strikes of the war, and that they have even opened another front in northern Ukraine. So when it comes to the situation on the battlefield, obviously Russia is also kind of in this place of saying, hey, sure, we'll continue these talks. We're happy to have dialogue with anyone that wants to talk with us, but we're still going to continue on the battlefield. So how do you see the situation when it comes to that active war?
This is a good point. And also with the so-called summer offensive, what I really think is happening, yes, there are seasons where fighting picks up. I don't believe that Russia is actually committing to what would be called a big arrow offensive. What they are doing is overseeing a strategy of attrition. So they're just continuously building up combat power and applying it all along the front line. And this is overstretching and collapsing Ukrainian fighting capacity. They're building out their military industrial production. They are, admittedly, the Western media admits this, they are building more missiles, more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined. And this is after this desperate attempt to expand production. The collective West simply cannot do it because of systemic problems that they have and that they refuse to fix. So we're going to see this continue. The fact that Russia is gaining more territory now than before, if that's what they're reporting, they're not trying to take territory. They're just applying pressure. And as the Ukrainian lines crumble, they move forward and they take that territory. And I had warned that this would happen. When Ukrainian fighting capacity begins to collapse more and more territory will be taken. It will cascade out of control until there's a complete collapse. When that will happen, I have no idea. I don't believe in trying to predict these things, but in the Western media, you often hear them say, well, it's a stalemate. The Russians are slowing down. They're not taking as much territory as they would need to for this to be viable. At this rate of taking territory, it will take them 100 years to take all of Ukraine. Just think back to the conflict in Syria. That was a U.S. proxy war against the central government of Syria. The Syrian government held out for years and years. There were entire years where not a single inch was gained by U.S.-backed proxies. And then late last year, the entire country collapsed and these US-backed proxies overran the entire country. So something very similar could happen in Ukraine. And I think this is why we see such a hard push by the US, by Europe, to try to corner Russia politically and diplomatically, maybe in a way militarily by trying to threaten further escalation, trying to get them to agree to a ceasefire so they can freeze this conflict, and then buy themselves time and space to try to tilt things back in their favor. Whether that can be done or not, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we continue to watch, because you're right, these reports here in the West, they do kind of frame it in that way. I know that New York Times will often say, oh, well, it is kind of a stalemate, right? And then they'll admit later on that, yeah, Russia's actually taking more territory. But the significance of that territory is what we need to be focusing on, the significance of what Russia's doing overall. And we have seen when it comes to kind of Russia's goals, because I know that that's the thing that people focus on as well, right? They look at what Russia has said and they're like, okay, they talk about these broad goals, whether it be demilitarization or denazification. What does that actually look like in real terms? Recently, we've seen Russian President Putin again talking about some sort of a buffer zone. Now, we obviously don't know where that buffer zone would be. We know that we have, Russian troops that have taken control in the Donbass, in these 4 regions where they now view them as part of the Russian Federation after referendums that were held in 2022. But they've also taken control in parts of regions such as Sumy and Kharkov, which they don't necessarily view as part of Russia. So, how do you view Russia's overall goals right now? Is this talk of a buffer zone kind of more of a warning to NATO that, hey, there's going to be a buffer zone at some point as they kind of continue on chipping away at the Ukrainian military?
I think that might be what Russia is trying to do, constantly raise the stakes for the US and also for Europe, letting them know the longer this conflict goes on, the more of Ukraine is going to permanently disappear. That is what we have seen taking place. We remember at the very beginning, 2014, Ukraine had complete control over all of its territory, including Crimea, even though it had special status while part of Ukraine. From 2014, they lost Crimea. And then from 2022 onward, they lost first the Donbas region, then Kherson, Zaporozhye, and now we see Russian forces expanding their presence in Kharkov, Sumy, and the list might expand. And this is what they have repeatedly warned would happen. Unfortunately, especially for anyone who actually cares about Ukrainian sovereignty, I don't think the United States minds. I don't think they mind. I think, and I think they've said this publicly, they're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. I don't think they care at all about what happens to Ukraine as a nation state. I think it's serving a purpose of extending Russia, forcing Russia to commit, locking it in there in Eastern Europe. And we could see how that has played to America's advantage in the Middle East, the collapse of Syria. If Russia wasn't tied up in Ukraine, they almost certainly would have been able to help the Syrian government hold on and avoid the total collapse of that country. So there's a lot going on. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the United States is simply using it. It couldn't be more obvious. And there is no way this story ends favorably for Ukraine, unfortunately, unless they make a deal directly with Russia, but they can't because their government has been politically captured. It is completely controlled by the US. So is their military. So is their intelligence network. So it's unfortunate, and this is just going to have to play out.
Yeah, and that right there, as you noted, it's like that needs to be the message that I think needs to be amplified more. The fact that the US and the West as a whole, they're willing to let Ukraine burn, right? They do not care about the Ukrainian people. And we've obviously seen that. If they did, we would not be at this point with this ongoing war. But they're happy to let Ukraine be that sacrificial lamb so that they can target Russia and so that they can try to weaken the Russian economy. And as you noted there, continue to extend Russia further and keep them tied up in Ukraine. And as I'm watching, going back to Germany's new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, and what he's saying of, we're going to partner with Ukraine and help them develop their own long-range weapons, watching Europe, and they're doing exactly what the US is telling them to do, right? They're getting more and more tied up in this ongoing war. What is the message that then sends to Russia? Because it seems like you've got Russia in this place where they're like, hey, as long as we have a buffer zone, as long as we have some guarantees, that there's going to be neutrality in Ukraine, it seems as though Russia may actually consider some sort of a deal. But the West is almost putting them in this place where they have to continue to fight to the last Ukrainian to then get to that point where we're not fighting this exact same war a decade down the road.
Exactly. And I think Russia realizes what is really going on here. This escapes a lot of people, even people who have been following this closely since 2022 or even 2014. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It is a war between the United States and Russia. And the US is fighting it through Ukraine, but also to a great extent through the rest of Europe. And so the idea of Russia agreeing, like even if President Trump said, okay, neutrality for Ukraine, we'll stop this, we'll stop that. What guarantee is there that they won't immediately restart this somewhere down the road. The problem is America and its ambition to project primacy over the entire planet. They refuse to invest in America and then deal with the rest of the world among other nations rather than imposing itself on all other nations. And until that changes, Russia is going to have to continue this struggle in Ukraine. Iran is going to have to continue struggling in the Middle East. China is going to have to continue struggling in the Asia Pacific region, where the US has it surrounded with its military. The US has no intention of making peace, of allowing the world to have peace, stability, and prosperity. And until that changes, all of these nations are going to be forced to continue defending themselves. That is what Russia is doing. This is existential for Russia. This is why it is a high price that they're paying, but they're willing to pay it because they understand the alternative. There is no negotiating with a nation driven by interests that see the entire planet as theirs, and the idea of another nation preserving its sovereignty as being unacceptable. You cannot negotiate with interests like this. Russia does negotiate with the US and talk with them and talk with Europe. The purpose of this is to constantly provide exit ramps. If the US or Europe feels like this just isn't going to work, there will be some juncture in the future where this is a problem and the US will need an off ramp. Russia, China, or even Iran, they're offering them one after the other, and they can choose to take them any time that they finally decide to.
Yeah, it's almost like the trade talks that we did see between the US and China, where you have Beijing in this place where they're like, hey, you want to back off from your tariff? Sure, we're happy to work with you on that. And then Trump acts like he, quote unquote, won that round, when in reality, that's the opposite of what happened. He didn't really get Beijing to do anything other than just say, okay, sure, let's back off from this current version of the trade war. And what's interesting too, because I think that that's an important thing that needs to be factored in when it comes to how Russia, China, and Iran respond. The fact that they're not just sitting around and waiting to see what the US possibly does. And I know that we're seeing an increase right now in the number of Ukrainian drones that are targeting Russia. I mean, last week we even had the Russian Defense Ministry revealing that Putin's helicopter was caught in a swarm of drones while he was visiting the Kursk region. And it's a reminder to me that the US, while yes, it is targeting all of these nations in all of these different ways, it's also giving Russia a lot of combat experience, right? It's giving them 3 years of learning how to ramp up their air defenses to the point where they're better than ever, to learning how to then target US technology. Is that something that you think is being factored in on the US side, and they should be realizing, right? They should be seeing Iranian air defenses, Chinese military technology, as we saw play out between India and Pakistan, and kind of figuring out that, wait a second, we're picking all of these fights around the world, and all of these countries are working both behind the scenes and out in front of everyone to figure out how to combat our technology. And that could be very bad for us long term.
I think a lot of senior officers in the US military are pointing this out. If you listen to these long, boring, sometimes 3-hour plus Senate hearings, and they bring in these experts, and they're all talking about how the disparity between the US and the rest of the world militarily, how that gap has been closing. And in a lot of ways, it's emerging again, but in favor of nations like Russia and China. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of a clock that is ticking. They're not ever going to be able to reassert dominance the way they had at the end of the Cold War, or even throughout the Cold War. That is not ever going to happen again. If you look at the rise of China, if you look at just Russia and its military industrial base and how it has evolved over just the last 3 years, but it's probably since 2014 onward, how rapidly it has expanded and innovated, and the type of systems that they have created. And the US and Europe are always talking about these vast sums of money that they spend on their militaries, and yet they're not able to match Russia. And this is something that's just going to continue expanding. Russia and China are going to continue building now a gap where they have the advantage militarily and in terms of industrial production. And so the US is trying to figure out what can they do with what they have now to reassert primacy over the planet, to undermine, collapse Russia and China so that they don't continue advancing along this path. And I just don't think that it's going to work. However, I would warn people about underestimating the United States. Its military power is waning. It still has very, very powerful means of politically interfering, politically capturing other countries, undermining peace and stability inside countries, if not the Russian Federation or China directly, many nations along their periphery. We see this taking place even now. A lot of people believe the NED and USAID are somehow gone. They're not. They're still very much there, and they're working very hard to continue trying to balance this in America's favor, where their military power no longer is sufficient. They have these asymmetric means to continue encircling, surrounding, containing Russia, China, Iran, and destabilizing, if not within their borders, all along it.
Yeah, and important things to keep in mind. And another reminder, and I know we were saying this when the Trump administration came in and they said, we're doing away with USAID. And everyone goes, okay, well, what are you doing with the funding? Oh, we're giving it to the State Department, which Marco Rubio is in charge of. It's like, yeah, I don't exactly think that the US establishment is going to stop being the US establishment, especially when you still have these key swamp creatures out in these very powerful positions. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down and to give very important insight into the latest. Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.